very much. From the University of Missouri, from the Columbian Missourian, we now have Tim Tai, who's a photojournalist for the paper, and Aaron Reiss, who's a sports reporter.
Does everyone here know what happened at Mizzou? Does anyone need to explain it or what happened? Okay, cool. That's great. That saves me time. I should just, I guess it's probably worth noting that the Missourian technically isn't like a student paper. The way our curriculum works is that this is part of our curriculum within the J School. The Missourian is a citywide paper, and so I am just a reporter. I mean, now I'm a TA, so I kind of work with my bosses. There. So that's my professor / editor. Greg, and so all our editors are professional adults, etc. So basically what I kind of want to talk to you guys about, I guess, is just my experience with covering this from a football perspective, because that's what I did for the paper this past semester, is cover the football team. And was not expecting for all this to happen when I said I was going to cover the football team. Full disclosure though, when the football team announced that it was going to be boycotting, I was actually in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, watching the LSU-Alabama game with friends because I drove down there. Mizzou had played a Thursday night game, so I drove on Friday. The game was on Saturday. And then Sunday, I was frantically driving back to Columbia. But really, though, what I want to talk about is planning, and if something like this happens, it wouldn't have truly made that much of a difference if I was in Columbia, because we had 3 guys, including myself, cover the football team. And so while they were kind of waiting on campus most of the days, waiting around for athletes to give no comment, or waiting for Tim Wolf to give no comment or deliver a statement, on the car ride back with friends, I was spending most of the car ride back on the phone. And so what I did was I called academics and sports business, or I called Ramogi Huma, who's the president of the National Collegiate Players Association, called parents, or players' parents, etc. And that was incredibly valuable, because basically what it allowed me to do is we had built up some ideas and topics of what was kind of really at issue here, and that allowed us to think about what fell under the umbrella of this issue, and kind of allowed us to think as we move forward what are our stories, not just on the day Tim Wolf resigns, but our stories after that. So one of the stories we did the next day, I wrote this the next day, was how could the football team brand this? From a selling tickets perspective, is it a positive thing that Gary Pinkel wants to stand in solidarity with his players? And the other stories we wrote were they played BYU this week, so we wrote a story about what the mood was we called people in Utah, and what was the mood in Provo, Utah, when BYU didn't know if it was going to be playing this game against this, what was for BYU, a marquee opponent. What else did we write? I'm trying to think. Oh, what did recruits think of this? All that. So it was that's a big thing when I think something like this falls under, or happens, is kind of sit down, and on November 9th, after we filed our stories from that day, when Tim Wolf resigned, we thought about what fell under this umbrella, and we just kind of went back and forth on it. And for me, I obviously knew about what was happening, but before it crossed over into sports, I wasn't paying immense attention to it, I think like a lot of people. And so what was important for me too was, and I think in general if this happens, is think about who else in your paper has been doing this already. Look at that coverage. Think about who you can talk to. Those sorts of things. And then also, like I said, having talked to experts on the phone when I was driving back to Missouri, that really helped, because it gave me context as to what were some of these issues. What were this professor from Ohio bringing up on the phone when I was talking to him? What was Ramogi Huma saying was at issue here? And that kind of brings me to the next thing, which was this idea that came up a lot, was the black athlete. Obviously, the race was the central part of this. And this was a story that we did. We produced a magazine before every home game. So this came out, I guess, not the Friday of that week, but the Friday after. We did it, but the content was basically, the story was done in 4 days with me and one other reporter. And it was kind of a longer sort of story. But this was kind of, again, it was what fell under here, but taking a little bit more time. It was an idea that we had as a daily story, and we expanded upon it. And I'm trying to think what else. This was what I was most proud of from it, because I think, especially with sports, what's cool is, football coverage drives our traffic on the website by far. And this allowed a lot of people who otherwise wouldn't care about this issue, or didn't think that it was really an issue or something they should care about at all. It made them care about it. This story specifically kind of humanized the issue, I think, in a lot of ways, and gave people a greater understanding of it. This top part is, we had an athlete kind of anonymously tell us about some of the things in a meeting and how the genesis of this, and add details to boycott and all that. The best part of it being at the end when, at a meeting with all student athletes, and the athletic director, Charles Harris, the defensive end, said, if you cut the head off, the whole dragon will fall, as to why they wanted to get rid of Tim Wolf. And I think that's important when you're thinking about these enterprise pieces moving forward, is how can you, one, just add more details to a story people know about but want to receive more information about. Two, how can you fit in kind of a historical context, which is what we get out a little bit further with the history of athlete activism. We talked to in Wyoming in the 60s, someone went a boycott, so we talked to them about that. And how can it fit into a cultural context? We talked about how in this story, how social media was vital for the athletes because they live in sort of a bubble, and being an athlete in one corner of campus, but they can still be educated about this. And when they announced their boycotting, they did so over Twitter. And lastly, I mean, it humanizes it, right? Because I think so many people were saying that these guys were, the term a lot of people used, were inmates running the asylum. And that was not something that we thought was correct. We wanted to show what is the black student athlete experience. And so that's kind of what this story accomplished. This project I'm working on now is the 4 athletes who are kind of the main athletes at the center of this boycott, looking at what their lives kind of are and what influenced them to take this role in activism, look at where they came from, who influenced them in their understanding of race and activism, etc. So a couple weeks ago I went to Kansas City, and this guy's dad showed me around the neighborhood he grew up in, and like the inner city of Kansas City, and at a bigger picture level how Kansas City schools are not accredited, how that affects their understanding of like educational equality and obviously other forms of equality. Next week I'm going to Dallas to have this or 2 weeks, excuse me, to hang out with this guy while he is watching the NFL draft, seeing if he gets picked. Have him show me around and meet his relatives, meet the people that influenced him, that sort of thing. And I think that's just incredibly important. You want to be, with this sort of story, for me, it was important to show people what were people's motivations, what was, again, to humanize them. And there we go. It's coming back on here at least.
It'll take a second.
There we go. Yeah. It was an incredibly big story, but it was an incredibly unique situation, and I feel really like I learned a lot from it, and hopefully I helped it off. You guys have any questions, please feel free to talk to me. I'll let Tim give his presentation now.
Yeah, so I know we don't have that much time, but so how many of you are like photographers? Okay, that's more than I expected. How many of you are editors of your student papers? All right, y'all need to treat your photographers better, first of all. Photographers, am I right? Yeah, see? All right, so my name's Tim. I photographed the protest on November 9th for ESPN. Originally, actually I was called to do a story about the football team strike, but they called me about 20 minutes before Tim Wolf resigned. So the story kind of changed after that, and they were just like, get some general news coverage of this event. So I'll just scroll through these real quick. They were published on the ESPN site. But as I'm sure some of you know, there was like this confrontation with like a professor and some other people at this like rally site, and they try to physically block me and some other like journalists, and like one like professor who is now infamous, apparently like assaulted another guy who was recording this video of the incident, and she later got fired kind of as a result of this. But anyway, so I'm not really here to talk that much about that, but I think, just in terms of like, our purpose as journalists, and especially as a photojournalist, this photo is from 1970 at Kansas State University. It's pretty famous. Won the Pulitzer Prize in 1971. It's by John Paul Philo, who was a student at the time. And this was after the National Guard opened fire and killed several students at an anti-Vietnam War protest there. And so, this photo has kind of stuck in our collective memories. because it is such like a powerful, striking moment, right? In part I picked this to show because John Philo was a student at the time, right? Like our work matters. You never know when something big is going to happen like that, and the world need to see this, right? Even the students there didn't know that the National Guard was armed. They thought they just had rubber bullets, but it turns out they were just shooting real live ammo. And this is maybe a little less memorable, but it's more recent. Occupy protests at UC Davis in 2011 by a student journalist there, where UC police officer was photographed pepper spraying students peacefully protesting on the sidewalk at point blank range. That generated a lot of controversy and attention. And so, I want to say that, and this is an excerpt from the Race Beat, which is a book about covering civil rights. And Martin Luther King in the 60s was a big advocate of photography, and there's an anecdote where Flip Schulke, who was photographing for Life magazine, saw like police officers like brutally shoving down like children and other demonstrators at the time, and so this photographer stopped to help them because he saw they were being hurt. And Martin Luther King later found out about this and kind of admonished him and said, the world doesn't know this happened because you didn't photograph it. I'm not being cold-blooded about it, but it's so much more important for you to take a picture of us getting beaten up than for you to be another person joining in the fray. And so I think, the difference now is that we have the internet, right? So back then it was like if you weren't part of, if your story wasn't in like the mainstream media or like in the traditional media, no one was going to know about it. And now we have a platform that is somewhat more democratic in the sense that more people have a voice, more people have access to this to like get their stories out there. But I don't think that like replaces traditional journalism, I guess, right? Like Twitter, like you can't really find a tweet from a year ago. You can't. There's no context. There's no depth. Like it's like you have like people who rally around like hashtags and movements and stuff on Twitter, but like in terms of like journalism and like documenting events and understanding like the context of events and like what's going on, like the meaning behind those things, that's not really a great platform for that. And so, I think what all of this experience has taught me is that, as a journalist, like if people are skeptical of us and distrustful of us, like we should examine why that is and try to, show people that we are so relevant. And that means being more proactive and not reactive to events. I think it's like, a lot of it is like building relationships and going out and like instead of waiting for people to come to us, like going out and trying to find them and asking them like why they feel like our coverage isn't accurate or what issues they think we're not covering. Because back in the day it was like if there's an issue like if someone has to like basically petition like a news organization to go cover it, right? But now it's like they can just tweet about it or start a blog about it or start their own publication about it. And if there was like a recent study that came out this week, that's basically like half of like college students don't trust the media, or they go to alternative media sources first. And so that's really challenging, especially a student journalist. That I think a lot of times we get kind of discouraged that our work doesn't really matter, that we're like second-class journalists or whatever. So I guess the lesson I would leave all this with is that our work does matter. Things that we document do go on the historical record, especially just major events that happen on your university, and so we have to be proactive in trying to prove why we're still relevant today.